This video will be on Sartre's chapter on temporality. Sartre begins by discussing the phenomenology of the temporal dimensions, how they appear, the past, the present, the future. He then goes on to examine the ontology of temporality, its existence as a structure of our consciousness. And he finishes the chapter by reconciling the contradictory nature of time, the way it both separates, divides moments from each other, while also remaining as a unity. So the preceding chapter was titled The Immediate Structures of the For Itself, as Sartre was outlining the dyad that is fundamental to the For Itself. And now he is describing how temporality unfolds from this structure, how it unfolds from the dyad of reflection-reflecting. If we remember from the previous chapter, the reflection-reflecting structure outlined the way the For Itself is a relation to itself. This model, or this structure rather, is present in how we perceive time, since time will ultimately be shown as having multiplicity and unity. This is how Sartre takes full account of the phenomenal features of time and the continuity of its ontological reality. That is to say, this is how Sartre accounts for the unity of time, the passage that blends past, present, and future, with the multiplicity of time, the way it separates moments in time from each other, the before and after separation. So it's a bit tricky to organize conceptually, and there is this apparent contradiction. But if we think about the word now, or the instant, or the present, we're talking about time the way the word here functions in regard to space. Okay? So I think that's really important. Think about the word now and think about the word here in space. So if I say that I'm here, then I'm describing myself in terms of space. I'm describing my position and orientation in relation to the space that I'm in. But I'm not saying anything about space itself. So it becomes clear that the phenomenal qualities of temporality have to do with us. They have to do with our point of view upon the world of objects. The succession and the irreversibility of time have to do with the point of view that is the For Itself, as opposed to the reality of time, independent of how it appears to a For Itself. The ontological reality of time, the being of time, is as a structure of our consciousness, a structure that organizes the appearance of the temporal dimensions. This is why Sartre says that temporality is not. When Sartre examines Bergson and Descartes' conception of the past, he writes that if they considered the temporal phenomena in its entirety, they would have seen that my past is first of all mine. That is, that it exists as the function of a certain being which I am. So the past is personalized, and the future is as well. The future exists to afford itself as a possible. This possible is drawn up by our lack, and the source of lack is value. So the future provides the meaning for the present because it explains what our pursuit is aimed at. And we see from this how the temporal dimensions are all interpenetrating in the being of the For Itself. Now, just as I just said, what we lack or what we desire is determined by value. And the concept of value here is fairly straightforward. It aligns with how we use the word in common parlance. Ultimately, what we aim to fulfill by apprehending the being we have to be is our being in itself. And we will be reminded of this throughout Being in Nothingness, and we will be reminded of its futility, the impossibility of a For Itself in itself. We want to apprehend ourselves as being in itself, but our consciousness, in order to be in itself, cannot exist as a relation to itself. It would have to coincide with itself. That is what characterizes the absolute density of being in itself. It coincides with itself, like A equals A. So this impossibility is made clear as the predicament of the For Itself is constantly renewed. So with every upsurge of consciousness, as we close in on a future in the present, it appears as hollow. A future hollow, Sartre calls this. For with every upsurge of consciousness, the For Itself is both there in the future and fixed in the past. Every upsurge of consciousness includes a future possible. So we are always in pursuit of fulfilling this lack. The person, a forward self, as we remember, is a being that is what it is not and not what it is. Temporality helps us make sense of this. As a forward self, we always have a past, but we don't have a past the way we own an object. Rather, we are our past in the mode of having to not be it, because we are in constant flight away from ourselves, away from the past. We have surpassed ourselves into this present nothingness. This past that we are, that we sustain in our being, has been absorbed into the in itself. We are separated from it by the nothingness that we are, the nothingness of the present. And this nothingness haunts the present as a lack. And this lack orients us toward a future we have to be. The future we have to be is not yet. Hence, a being that is what it is not and not what it is. If we recall the chapter on bad faith, if I recognize myself as a coward in the present, then I've already surpassed my behavior as a coward. It drags behind me as I experience myself as a lack of courage. And this lack of courage directs me toward a future that I have to be, a future that I have to be courageous in. The immediate structures of the forward self introduce presence to self, that circuit, which is a nothingness separating reflection and reflecting. And this is the most difficult part of the book, really. There's this separation between the verb aspect of consciousness, reflecting, the intentionality, the aboutness, from the noun aspect of consciousness, the reflection, which includes an awareness of itself as consciousness of something. Okay, so that's reflecting and reflection. So, and there's a verb and a noun is the way I like to think about this. And you could see why consciousness would need to have some action involved, the intentionality, and this self-awareness in the background. So I guess that kind of makes sense. It's a very difficult concept. And when we step back and think about consciousness, we are referring to a self-awareness, a noun, and an awareness of something, this verb, intentionality. If consciousness was only self-awareness, it would be empty. So it is consciousness of something, and it includes a self-awareness. This is all part of the package of the pre-reflective consciousness. Now, when we direct consciousness onto itself, this whole package of self-awareness that includes reflecting and reflection, all we end up getting is reflection, which is the noun aspect of self-awareness. So when we turn our gaze onto our own consciousness, we lose the verb aspect. We fail to see ourselves as the subject that we are. That's the important point. So the pre-reflective consciousness has a self-awareness and an intentionality. And as we direct that intentionality to apprehend ourselves as a subject reflecting, the chain collapses, the circuit collapses back onto this noun of itself as consciousness of something. So I know that's really confusing, but by narrowing in on the most fundamental aspect of consciousness, Sartre identifies this fissure, this nothingness, separating consciousness from itself. And this allows consciousness to be present to itself. And so Sartre identifies nothingness at the most fundamental level and traces its role in every aspect of our consciousness. And there will always be this problem of not being able to see ourselves as the subject that we are. Okay, that's the most important point. We do not ever apprehend ourselves the way we apprehend an ordinary object, nor do we ever apprehend anything for what it is in itself. So that was a little bit of a digression. But this fissure, this duality that is unity, this separation bonded in being, this dyad comes into play in how we understand the relation between the multiplicity of time and the unity of time. Sartre accounts for the apparent contradiction with the multiplicity and unity of temporality with the categories of static and dynamic. With static temporality, Sartre establishes that our understanding of time has to include its power to separate. The organizing principle of before and after requires a division, a multiplicity, and yet we cannot lock any particular moment in its place while maintaining the unity of time, the way a future becomes a present becomes a past. When we focus on succession, we necessarily break up the unity to see an arrangement of moments independent of flow or change. We see a moment in itself without the flow. This flow or duration is what Sartre categorizes as dynamic. And so these categories consider the multiplicity and temporality. These categories consider the multiplicity of temporality and the unity of temporality. And this, of course, relates back to a being that is a relation to itself, the dyad at the heart of the for itself. The irreversibility of time, the way we keep track of ourselves in time, the compartmentalization of time into past, present, future, psychic objects that we reflect on, everything that makes time what it is experienced as has to do with the relation of the for itself with the in itself. It has to do with our point of view upon the world, our position in the world. In other words, it has to do with us. We bring the multiplicity to the unity. The being, the for itself temporalizes itself. The being of the for itself is outside of it. It is before it in the past, it is in front of it in the future. Time is not something that we apprehend like an object. Just like space, it is formatted as part of our consciousness. We carve into space-time by identifying objects to use as a means to an end. We do this through negation. If I were looking for a stone to skip on a pond, then I would negate the spherical stones to illuminate the flat ones. So we carve into the undifferentiated continuity of being to sort out the objects that make sense of our world according to our projected ends. And by objects, we do not simply mean tangible objects in space. There are also psychic objects in time. For example, we can define periods of time by the emotions that colored them. Sartre points out that to say that I was happy or have been happy is to say that I'm not happy. But it doesn't mean that I'm unhappy. This again is because I'm a being that is what it is not what it is. We are perpetually separated from the in itself that we are, our past, our facticity. And so we're in this pocket of nothingness. When we look back at our past and the psychic objects that organize our past, we consider our own being as if it were in itself. This is part of what makes bad faith an unavoidable issue for the for itself, because when we look back at ourselves, we can easily explain our freedom as part of the causality of determinism. But we're never simply an in itself. We are a structure of experience understood as the for itself, as consciousness. And this structure means that our being is always dispersed in the past and future. It is nothingness that unifies the past and future in the present. And this demonstrates the nothingness of human reality. Our freedom, for Sartre, is bound up with consciousness in such a way that every upsurge of consciousness is a choice of being. The reason why our consciousness should not be understood as an intervention or a disturbance of the in itself is because it is nothing. It does not obstruct anything within the causal chain of existence because it is a nothingness in the world of objects. As Sartre often points out, the in itself is. It cannot be opened or broken into different properties. It simply is. When we die, our lives are revealed as never standing outside of the causal relations we recognize around us and outside us. We do not disrupt any kind of equilibrium. Human reality fits into the streams of causality precisely because it is nothing. We should not think of human reality as an artificial interference with nature. Rather, what appears to us as our participation in reality is actually entirely embedded in the in itself. We do not escape the currents of causality, nor are we reducible to them, because we have freedom. Every upsurge of consciousness is a choice of being, and that choice, that freedom, is organized temporally. The future provides the meaning of our choice, of our present, and we aim our choices at the being we have to be. The being we have to be appears as a possible, and this possible emerges from what we lack. Not only can we not see ourselves the way we see an ordinary object, we also cannot see the reality in itself of objects. Rather, we have the appearance, and we imprint onto the appearance of things categories of human reality. We are subjects in the world of objects. To understand and reflect on our own consciousness, our transcendence, the for itself, is not to apprehend ourselves in union with this complete scheme of being in itself. We separate ourselves from nature. We separate items within nature and disassociate parts from the whole of being according to our needs, according to how we make the world intelligible to us in the moment-to-moment navigation of our lives. We recognize others as also in this predicament, and because of this, we are dissociated from the continuity of being in itself. We are not seamlessly placed within this nest of everything that is. Our agency, our consciousness, our freedom, nothingness, separates us from being in itself. As the present recedes into the past, it ossifies into being in itself. When we die, our being is entirely in itself. Everything that we ever were has now ossified into this absolute, indivisible, all-encompassing continuity of being in itself. The for itself is the point of view upon the objects of the physical world. It is the source of all differentiation. It is the source of all multiplicity. And differentiation, as we know, results from negation. We see then a simple and literal example of the nothingness that we are, in that we understand that our lives come to be and not be. They begin and end within this absolute nature of being. All of the items we organize in our world, everything from the agreed upon rules of a community to what we see when we look into a painting, these are all features of human reality. We apprehend them as we surpass being in itself, in pursuit of the for itself in itself that we can never achieve.